He drove through the late summer heat of 1985 with a car full of mismatched suitcases and a heart that had room for one more miracle. The adoption agency had said they were a complicated case, 3 girls with 3 different scars and one stubborn laugh that could break a room open. He had said yes before he knew all the details. He had said yes because when he sat with each of them for 20 minutes in the fluorescent little room and watched the way their eyes found his, curious, resistant, hungry, he felt something like destiny or stubbornness settle in his chest. They came to him on a Tuesday. The eldest, 12, braided hair, shoes scuffed from too many afternoons on concrete, a freckle under her left eye, the middle child, 9, who measured every inch of space like she owned it, and the littlest, 5, who wore her confidence like a cape and slept with one fist curled against her cheek. He signed the papers. The social worker smiled too quickly. They piled into his sedan and let out a small, uncertain chorus of giggles when he turned the radio up to a cassette tape with songs that smelled like freeways and cheap perfume. He learned how to change a diaper. He learned how to braid hair badly and then call their auntie down the block to fix it right. He learned what it felt like to get up at 3 in the morning because thunder made the smallest dream too loud and her tiny body needed the warmth of somebody who would not leave. He learned how to listen when the oldest grew quiet, how to hold his tongue while she decided whether her voice could be trusted. The house they moved into was a modest brick with a porch swing that squeaked in the best way and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of coffee and something baking. In the early years, the world outside stayed heavy and indifferent. There were mornings when the eldest came home with a note from school that felt like a verdict, things written in careful, adult voices about behavioral concerns. There were whispers in the grocery store, the tilted heads in the PTA meeting, the way neighbors introduced themselves with an apology in their voice because they didn't know what to say to a man raising 3 black girls in a neighborhood that had not seen that before. He taught them to answer questions when they wanted to and to walk away from definitions that tried to make them small. They called him Dad, though he was careful at first with titles. He believed heart over biology and chose his actions to match his words. He worked 2 jobs for a while, night shifts loading trucks and day shifts at a bookstore where he could steal moments to read the girls out loud to sleep. Those stories, heroes who looked nothing like them, queens who built empires, ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, wove themselves into the children's imaginations and stayed. He drove them to piano lessons, to soccer practice, to auditions where the judges sometimes saw everything but them. He learned the art of applauding small improvements and of making allowances for bad days. There were fights, schoolyard, sibling, and the kind where he realized being a father meant sometimes watching them make mistakes without stepping in. He taught consequences and forgiveness. He made mistakes, a too strict punishment, a poorly chosen word, and then sat with the fallout, apologizing when he needed to, showing that accountability was a muscle to be exercised. He learned to ask for help, to accept the neighbor's casserole, to let a teacher call him on a bad day. The community gradually became less of a closed room and more of a network of people who kept an eye on the porch light. Seasons turned. The oldest graduated high school and left for a university that was farther than he had imagined, clutching a scholarship letter like a map to possible futures. The middle one found a voice for her activism in college, organizing on campus for equal representation and mentoring younger students in the city's after-school program. The littlest, whose confidence had only blossomed, took to visual storytelling, photography and short films that captured corners of the city most people walked past. He watched them fold themselves into new lives and held his breath when life pressed too hard. For decades later, in 2025, the house on the corner still had the same chipped porch swing. He had fewer gray hairs than he expected at 72 and laugh lines that had been earned. The oldest, now 52, returned often with 2 kids of her own, twins who had inherited the same curious eyes and a stubborn laugh that sounded like the little girl who once clung to his shirt at the agency. She had built a career as an elementary school principal. She ran a school that prided itself on inclusive curricula and a library where every child could find a mirror or window in the pages. The middle daughter had a different map. At 49, she had become a civil rights attorney who took cases that no one else wanted. She had a calm intensity and a way of asking the question that made judges sit up straighter. She led a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated women re-enter society, offering job training and childcare support. She still had that habit of measuring the room, and now she measured impact, drafting policies that were practical and humane. The youngest had a camera and a gallery presence that surprised him. At 45, she showed work in community centers and boutique galleries, and she used imagery to create conversations. Her films focused on family memory, urban renewal, and the quiet dignity of labor. She had a daughter who would fall asleep in his lap, pointing at photographs with small fingers and demanding to know the stories behind each picture. The littlest was full of light in the same way she had been as a child, part fearless, part tender, and she taught him how to see through a lens that honored the ordinary. Their lives were not without scars. The oldest carried the exhaustion of schooling children while working nights at the beginning of her career. The middle had lost a close partner to illness and had learned to hold grief like a tool, shaping it into purpose. The youngest had been in and out of toxic relationships before learning how to keep herself safe. They argued occasionally like siblings do, over old splits and new decisions. But their foundation, the way they had been raised in a house that did not ask them to shrink for other people's comfort, kept them tethered. He watched them from a kitchen table now, napkins smudged with jam, the radio playing low in the background. He asked about court dates and gallery openings and the school's winter concert. He told stories of small domestic victories, the time the littlest fixed the lawnmower and came back triumphant, the recipe the middle had perfected, the oldest's dedication to a single student's reading progress. They laughed about the bad braids of his youth and the time he tried to make gumbo and mistook too much cayenne for courage. At family dinners, they honored rituals they had invented, a holiday of mismatched socks to celebrate individuality, a book exchange where every member left a hardback with a note inside, a spring cleaning where everyone came together to paint one wall a ridiculous color because the world needed jokes. He had taught them the language of chosen family, of loyalty that asked for nothing more than presence. They had taught him that love could bend without breaking, that parenting did not mean owning but stewarding a life toward its own light. Outside the comforts of the home, their impact resonated. The oldest implemented reading groups that lowered absenteeism in her school. The middle's legal victories set precedents in housing law that made apartments safer for low-income families. The youngest documentary about a neighborhood bakery saved the store from closing when public interest spiked and crowdfunding covered the debts. They used the lessons of their childhood, resilience, kindness, refusal to be defined by others' assumptions, in public and private, turning small acts into lasting change. People sometimes asked him if he regretted any part of the decision to adopt. They asked if it had been hard, if he had ever wanted different things. He would laugh, sometimes with a quick, sharp edge that hid fatigue, and say that there were days he had wanted a quiet life that didn't call for bandaging knees or negotiating curfews. He would admit that the paperwork alone had tried his patience. But he always returned to the same truth. He could not imagine his life without the chorus of their voices, without the particular way the house smelled when rain hit the garden, without the sound of their laughter filling the rooms. Now, when he walked through the neighborhood park, people nodded like old friends. The girls, women, mothers, creators, walked beside him sometimes with coffee cups in hand and sometimes with their children carrying the legacy of their laughter. At community gatherings they stood together in a way that announced something rare, that a family could be built across difference, survive the squeezes of the world, and still open its hands to give more back. One evening, as light slid between the trees and the twins raced around planting a sapling for the school's new courtyard, he felt like time had folded gently. He thought about the day in 1985 when he signed papers in a room that smelled like coffee and new beginnings. He thought about the mismatched suitcases and the girl who had slept with a fist against her cheek. He thought about the years of mistakes and quiet triumphs, the casseroles and courtrooms, the gallery openings and graduation speeches. He realized that adoption had not been an act of saving. It had been an agreement to learn from each other, to trade stories and stains on shirts, to show up when the world tried to tell them their place. The three daughters had given him as much as he had given them: courage to be softer, the ability to laugh louder, an expanded sense of what family could be. They had taught him that legacy is not about money or last names but about seeds planted in soil you tend with relentless hope. When he tucked the twins in that night, the littlest asked a question he had heard 1,000 times: "Did you always know we'd be happy?" He paused, smoothing the small hand that had once curled into his. "No," he whispered, "but I always believed you could be." She drifted to sleep with a smile, and he sat on the edge of the bed longer than he used to, thinking about how much love could fit into a life. Outside, the porch swing creaked in the evening breeze, and for a moment the world felt like a wide, forgiving place. Their story kept growing.